The moment a planet decides it no longer belongs to the Imperium, the decision is already too late. Somewhere between the first missed tithe shipment and the last unanswered astropathic call, an invisible line is crossed, one that does not exist on any chart or data slate but is nevertheless absolute. From that point onward, the world is no longer merely distant or disobedient. It is suspect, watched, counted. The Imperium does not feel betrayal as an emotion. It registers it as a threat condition, the same way a void ship's cogitator registers a hull breach. And once that condition is logged, the response unfolds with the cold certainty of a system that has endured 10,000 years by never forgiving fracture. If this kind of story draws you in, if you want to understand not just what the Imperium does, but why it believes it must, then mark this moment. Share it with others who linger at the edges of these questions, and bind yourself to this channel, because there are countless worlds that wondered if they could walk away, and almost none of them survived the answer. The first sign was not a riot or a speech, or a banner pulled down from a spire. It was a number that did not arrive when it was supposed to. A shipment logged in a ledger on Terra's far side, expected by habit rather than hope, simply failed to resolve from pending to received. In the grand machinery of the Imperium, this happened constantly, 1,000 times a day across 1,000,000 worlds, and most of the time it meant nothing. A storm in the warp, a clerical delay, a misfiled data slate. In our world, it meant that someone, somewhere, had decided that time still belonged to us. I was a junior adepter in the planetary tithe office then, low-ranked enough that my duties consisted mostly of cross-checking manifests and stamping confirmations that would be forwarded up the chain and never return. The administratum building squatted at the heart of the capital hive like an afterthought made of stone, its halls echoing with the soft shuffle of parchment and the whine of overworked cogitators. We worked by lumen glow that never quite reached the corners, breathing air filtered so many times it tasted of nothing at all. When the first shipment did not register, it was flagged automatically, a pale amber sigil pulsing on my terminal. I noted it, filed the exception, and moved on. The governor was not informed. There was no reason to trouble him. Our world's tithe grade was modest, predictable, and historically punctual. We provided promethium derivatives, processed grain, and a rotating levy of Astra Militarum recruits, drawn mostly from the lower habs, where hunger made loyalty pliable. A missed shipment could be corrected next cycle. The Imperium was patient with worlds that had always paid their due. That patience, I would learn, was not mercy. It was inertia. Weeks passed. The next shipment left on time, its departure logged and sanctified by the proper rites. I watched the servitors seal the containers myself, their augmetic limbs moving with the same indifference they brought to everything else. The cargo haulers lifted into the polluted sky, contrails dissolving into the haze, and for a moment the anxiety I had not admitted to eased. But when the astropathic confirmation failed to return, the amber sigil appeared again, joined now by a second. 2 points of absence, small but aligned, like stars that should not have formed a constellation. It was still not a rebellion. No one used that word. In the break chambers, over thin recaf that tasted faintly of rust, the clerks speculated in low voices. Warp interference was the favoured explanation. The sector had been unstable of late, whispers of storms folding roots in on themselves. Others suggested misrouting, an error in designation that would be corrected once the oversight was noticed. These were comfortable theories because they required no action. They allowed us to continue our work as if the system would resolve itself through sheer momentum. The governor's court felt the pressure first, though few understood it at the time. Requests for clarification arrived from off-world authorities, phrased in neutral, almost apologetic language. Could the discrepancy be confirmed? Were there local disruptions affecting output? Has the tithe assessment been reviewed recently? Each inquiry was answered with care, couched in the appropriate deference, assuring Terra and its representatives that the matter was being investigated and corrected. No one lied. No one needed to. Uncertainty was still plausible. On the streets, life went on unchanged. Manufacturums belched smoke into the sky. Hab blocks flickered with unreliable power, and the endless press of humanity continued its familiar patterns. The Imperial Aquila still hung above every public entrance, its presence so constant it had become invisible. Sermons were preached, quotas were met, and the planetary defense drills proceeded on schedule. If there was a sense of tension, it was subtle, a tightening felt only by those whose work involved numbers and timelines rather than labor and muscle. I noticed the first real shift when the audits began, not the routine internal reviews we conducted quarterly, but external inquiries, their data signatures unmistakable, requests for raw figures rather than summaries, demands for original manifests, unedited Auspex logs, and astropathic transcripts going back years. These were not accusations, they were examinations, clinical and thorough, and they carried with them an implication that chilled me more than any overt threat. The Imperium was no longer waiting, it was looking. The governor convened a closed session of his senior staff shortly after the third missed confirmation. I was not present, but the building seemed to hold its breath while they met. When they emerged, faces carefully arranged into neutrality, orders filtered down quickly. Output was to be increased where possible. Non-essential exports were suspended. Recruitment quotas were adjusted upward. The age range widened with minimal explanation. These were framed as precautionary measures, steps taken to ensure continued compliance. To me, they felt like the tightening of a fist. Still, there was no declaration, no denunciation. The Imperium does not rush these things. It had learned, across millennia of fractured worlds and burned systems, that panic created instability faster than any external threat. Better to let a planet hang in uncertainty, to watch how it behaved when pressure was applied lightly. Would it be the correct course? Would it fracture internally? Would it reveal deeper flaws? Every response was data. Whispers began to circulate among the lower clerks, rumors of visitors passing through the starport under sealed authority. Not traders or pilgrims, but officials whose papers carried seals none of us recognized. They stayed briefly, spoke to few, and departed without ceremony. Their presence was never acknowledged publicly, but their questions rippled outward, subtle changes in how information was requested and routed. I found myself triple-checking figures that had once been routine, aware that mistakes no longer meant reprimand, but attention. At home, my family noticed the changes before I spoke of them. Power rationing became more frequent, scheduled outages replacing the random flickers we were accustomed to. Food distribution tightened, the variety narrowing as reserves were redirected toward export. The official announcements framed these measures as efficiency improvements, necessary adjustments to meet imperial expectations. The language was careful, respectful, but it carried an undercurrent of urgency that seeped into daily life. People complained quietly, as they always had, but there was a new edge to it, a question forming that no one dared to articulate. The ecclesiarchy responded in its own way. Sermons grew more focused on obedience, on the sacred duty of tithe and sacrifice. Priests spoke of historical examples, worlds that had faltered and suffered until they returned to the emperor's light. These were not threats, precisely, but reminders. The congregations listened, heads bowed, voices rising in familiar hymns, yet the mood had shifted. Faith was being asked to do more work than before, to shore up confidence where certainty had begun to erode. The fourth missed confirmation triggered a change in designation. I watched it happen on my terminal, the status shifting from amber to red, the sigil pulsing with a new insistence. A priority marker attached itself automatically, accompanied by a string of codes that required higher clearance to access. I sent the notification up the chain with hands that trembled despite my efforts to remain composed. This was no longer an irregularity. It was a pattern. Within days, an Imperial Navy liaison arrived in system, his vessel anchoring itself in high orbit with a presence that could not be ignored. The announcement was brief, couched in diplomatic language, but the message was unmistakable. The Imperium was here to assist in resolving our difficulties. Assistance, in this context, meant scrutiny backed by firepower. Void traffic was monitored more closely. Certain routes were restricted pending review. The sky itself felt heavier, as if the world had been placed under a glass dome. The governor addressed the populace shortly after, his image projected across public vox grills. He spoke calmly, reassuringly, emphasizing cooperation and shared purpose. There had been misunderstandings, he said, logistical challenges exacerbated by sector-wide instability. These were being addressed in coordination with Imperial authorities. Our loyalty was unquestioned. Our future is secure. The speech was met with polite applause in the plazas, but as the image faded, the murmurs returned, louder now, less easily dismissed. In the tithe office, the workload doubled. Requests came in rapid succession, often overlapping, sometimes contradictory. Different branches of the administratum wanted the same data presented in slightly different formats, each insisting on priority. It was exhausting and deliberate. Compliance was no longer assumed, it was being tested, measured not just in outcome but in speed and accuracy. Every delay was noted, every correction logged. I began to understand then that rebellion did not begin with defiance. It began with friction, with the accumulation of small resistances, intentional or not, until the system responded by tightening its tolerances. Our world had not declared independence. It had not raised arms against the Imperium. It had simply failed to meet expectations often enough that expectation itself had become pressure. The first open protest occurred outside a grain distribution centre in the mid-Habs, sparked by a delayed ration allotment. It was small, quickly dispersed by enforcers, and officially classified as a labour dispute. Yet picked captures of the event circulated briefly before being scrubbed, showing banners hastily painted with slogans that skirted the edge of sedition without crossing it. Calls for fairness, for local priority, for recognition of hardship. None of it named the Imperium directly, but the implication was there, hanging unspoken in the air. The response was swift and understated. Additional enforcer patrols were deployed, curfews were adjusted. A handful of agitators were arrested and disappeared into the system without public record. Life resumed its outward normalcy, but the line had moved. The Imperium had learned something about us, and we had learned something about ourselves. The silence that followed was not relief. It was an assessment. I filed my reports, answered my queries, and watched the red sigil pulse steadily on my terminal. Somewhere far above, in places I would never see, decisions were being weighed that would shape the fate of everyone I knew. The first, missed tithe had seemed insignificant, a clerical hiccup in an empire built on excess. Now it felt like the opening note of a symphony that only one side knew how to finish. When I left the administratum building that night, the sky was clear enough to see the faint glimmer of orbital traffic, lights tracing slow, deliberate arcs overhead. I paused, just for a moment, and felt a sense of being observed that had nothing to do with eyes. The Imperium had noticed us. Not with anger, not yet, but with interest. And in that attention lay the beginning of something irreversible. A process that did not care about intention or innocence, only about outcome. We still believed then that correction was possible, that the numbers could be fixed, the shipments rerouted, the confirmations restored. We believed that compliance was a state we could return to by effort alone. What we did not yet understand was that the Imperium measures loyalty not by recovery, but by consistency. And once consistency is broken, even briefly, the question is no longer how to fix the error, but how far it will be allowed to spread before it is cut away. Silence has weight when it lasts too long. At first it feels like relief, the absence of reprimand taken as permission to breathe again. In our world, that silence settled in after the Imperial Navy liaison ship took its place in high orbit and did nothing. No bombardment, no ultimatum, no visible escalation beyond tighter traffic control, and a growing web of inquiries that threaded through every administrative channel. For a brief, dangerous stretch of time, people began to believe that we had been noticed and found wanting, but not yet condemned. That belief was a sedative, and like all sedatives, it dulled the senses when sharpness was most needed. The administratum offices became quieter in subtle ways. Fewer idle conversations, less speculative humour over recaf. Clerks spoke in measured tones, aware that walls had always listened, but might now be remembering. The cogitators seemed louder by contrast, their constant whine filling gaps where human voices once lingered. Data slate requests arrived marked with new priority sigils, their phrasing precise and stripped of courtesy. Silence from terror had not meant disinterest. It meant correlation. Astropathic traffic slowed, then narrowed. Messages still passed, but the redundancy vanished. Where once 3 confirmations might arrive from different nodes, now there was one, sometimes none. The sanctioned psychers assigned to the planetary choir reported increased strain, headaches that lingered longer than usual, dreams that left them shaken and withdrawn. Officially, this was attributed to warp turbulence. Unofficially, everyone understood that reduced traffic meant increased scrutiny. Every thought sent outward now mattered more because there were fewer of them. On the streets, the change manifested as patience wearing thin. People waited longer for less, queues stretching through transit tunnels and into the open air. Manufacturum shifts were extended without corresponding increases in ration allotments. Overseers cited new efficiency mandates, their voices rehearsed, their eyes avoiding contact. The Imperial Aquila still hung above every gate and archway, but now it seemed to watch rather than preside. A symbol unchanged can become accusation simply by context. The governor's palace grew more insular, fewer public appearances, fewer proclamations. Decisions that once took weeks were made overnight, then revised again within days. Loyalist advisors rose in prominence, their counsel favouring strict adherence and visible compliance over local accommodation. Others faded quietly from influence, reassigned or retired with little explanation. The court was reorganising itself around fear, though no one named it as such. I first heard the word suspicion spoken aloud in the tithe office by a senior clerk who had survived 3 planetary audits in her career. She said it softly, as if it might trigger something merely by being voiced. Silence doesn't mean patience, she murmured, while reviewing a stack of manifests. It means they're listening. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Her hands shook slightly as she returned the data slate to its cradle. The first investigators arrived without announcement. They did not wear uniforms that marked them clearly, and their credentials were displayed only when necessary. Seals flashed and withdrawn with practiced efficiency. They asked for access to records that predated the current discrepancies, tracing patterns backward rather than forward. They did not accuse. They did not threaten. They observed. Their questions were disarmingly simple, forcing answers that revealed more through omission than confession. One asked me why our recruitment quotas had risen so sharply in the past 2 cycles. I gave the prepared response, citing labour reallocation and increased output demands. He nodded, made a note, and asked why the additional recruits had not yet been shipped off-world. That delay, I explained, was due to transport availability. Another nod, another note. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet I felt exposed, as if something essential had been catalogued and set aside for later use. Rumours multiplied in the absence of official explanation. Some claimed the investigators were agents of the administratum's more severe branches, empowered to recommend sanctions. Others whispered that the Inquisition had taken an interest, that our world's irregularities had triggered deeper concern. That word carried particular terror not because of what it meant in practice, but because of what it implied. If the Inquisition was involved, then the question was no longer whether we had erred, but whether we were dangerous. The ecclesiarchy adjusted its tone again. Sermons shifted from reminders of duty to warnings about vigilance, about the ease with which doubt could invite corruption. Priests spoke of silence as a test, a period in which the faithful were expected to demonstrate obedience without reassurance. The emperor, they said, did not always answer prayers immediately. Sometimes he waited to see who would continue kneeling in the dark. The congregations listened, and the hymns grew louder, as if volume could compensate for uncertainty. In the lower Habs, enforcer patrols became more visible. Checkpoints appeared at transit hubs, scanners sweeping crowds with impersonal efficiency. Officially, this was for security, a precaution against unrest. In practice, it was a reminder of boundaries, of the fact that movement itself was conditional. People learned new routes, quieter paths through maintenance corridors and service tunnels, adapting as they always had. Adaptation, however, was no longer invisible. It was being watched. Silence from orbit persisted. The Navy ship did not move closer. It did not fire warning shots or broadcast demands. It simply remained, a fixed presence against the stars, its mass and purpose undeniable. Void traffic controllers reported that requests for clearance were taking longer to process, that approvals came with additional conditions attached. The sky had become a bottleneck, and everyone could feel it. Within the administratum, a new designation appeared on certain files, accessible only to those with elevated clearance. I did not have that clearance, but I saw the markers when files passed through my station, the subtle shift in color and code that indicated restricted analysis. These were worlds within worlds, layers of judgment forming beyond our reach. Silence was not emptiness, it was stratification. At home, my family stopped asking when things would return to normal. The question had proven too exhausting. Instead, they focused on preparation, setting aside extra rations when possible, repairing clothing rather than replacing it, conserving power whenever the lumen strips flickered. These were small acts, almost unconscious, but they spoke to a growing understanding that stability was no longer guaranteed. We did not speak of leaving. No one did. Departure implied permission, and permission was precisely what was in question. The first sanctioned seizure occurred in the mid-Habs, though it was framed as a routine enforcement action. A manufactorum overseer was arrested for falsifying output reports, his facility placed under temporary control pending review. Official channels praised the action as evidence of Imperial justice functioning as intended. Unofficially, people noted how quickly it had happened, how little resistance had been possible once the decision was made. The lesson was absorbed without being taught directly. Astropathic silence deepened. Messages sent outward were acknowledged less frequently, and when replies came, they were terse, stripped of context. The choirmaster resigned, citing health concerns, replaced by a quieter figure whose authority rested more on discipline than empathy. The psychers themselves became more withdrawn, their eyes shadowed, their speech clipped. Whatever they felt moving through the warp, they did not share it openly. Silence, again, layered upon silence. I began to dream of numbers that would not balance, of ledgers that stretched on forever without resolution. I woke with the sense of being examined, of having failed a test I did not remember taking. During waking hours, the feeling did not fade. It was present in the way conversations paused when unfamiliar footsteps approached, in the way people checked Vox grills twice before speaking, in the way laughter died quickly, as if it might be misconstrued. The governor finally addressed the population again, this time without projecting confidence. His speech emphasized unity and patience, the need to trust imperial processes. He acknowledged delays and hardships, framing them as shared burdens in uncertain times. There was no mention of investigation or suspicion. That omission was louder than any admission. The crowd listened politely, but the applause was thinner, more restrained. Trust had begun to fracture, not in open defiance, but in quiet doubt. Behind closed doors, contingency planning accelerated. Emergency protocols were reviewed. Stockpiles were inventoried with new urgency. The Planetary Defense Force increased readiness drills, their presence more visible in public spaces. Official statements described this as precautionary. Unofficially, everyone understood that preparation implied expectation. Silence from the Imperium had not reassured anyone who understood its habits. The investigators departed as quietly as they had arrived. There was no announcement, no summary of findings. Their absence left a void more unsettling than their presence. Had we passed some threshold? Had we failed? There was no feedback, no corrective guidance, only the continued pressure of reduced communication and heightened oversight. Silence had become a verdict deferred. In the tithe office, the red sigils remained. No new confirmations arrived. The backlog grew, not because we failed to process shipments, but because acknowledgement no longer returned. It was as if our messages vanished into a vast space where they were read, judged, and set aside without response. That realization settled over us like a sentence we could not hear spoken. The word rebellion was still not used. It did not need to be. Silence had accomplished what accusation would have done more clumsily. It had isolated us, slowed us, forced us to reveal our stress points through reaction rather than declaration. The Imperium was learning how we bent before it decided whether we would break. One evening, as I left the Administratum building, I looked up at the sky and found the Navy vessel harder to see, its outline blending into the stars. For a moment, it seemed almost gone. Then, its running lights pulsed faintly, deliberately, a reminder of presence without engagement. That was when I understood that silence was not the absence of attention. It was its purest form. We were no longer simply a world that had missed a tithe. We were a case under observation, our behavior recorded in the space between messages. The Imperium had not spoken judgment, but it had begun to listen in earnest. And once silence reaches that stage, it does not last forever. It ends with a word that changes everything. And when that word arrives, it does not arrive gently. The word arrived without ceremony. It did not thunder through the vox grills or blaze across public pict screens. It was appended to a data slate classification update, a single line added beneath our world's designation, transmitted through channels that only certain officers were authorized to receive. Status: rebellis. I saw it by accident, a flicker on a terminal that was not meant to show me such things, and in that instant, the silence that had pressed on us for months finally resolved into meaning. The Imperium had spoken, quietly, irrevocably. Nothing changed immediately, and that was the most terrifying part. The streets did not erupt. The manufactorums did not fall silent. The ecclesiarchy did not denounce us from the pulpits. Life continued with the same strained normalcy it had worn since the first missed tithe. Yet beneath that surface, everything had shifted. The designation did not describe an act we were about to commit. It described a conclusion that had already been reached. Orders followed, filtered and precise. They were addressed to the governor and his court, to senior administratum officials, to the commanders of the Planetary Defense Force. They did not ask for explanations. They outlined expectations, immediate compliance audits, consolidation of authority, suspension of all non-essential planetary travel. The language was clinical, stripped of any pretense of dialogue. The Imperium was no longer observing behavior, it was correcting it. The governor addressed the population that same cycle, his image appearing on vox grills across the capital hive and beyond. His face was drawn, his voice controlled with visible effort. He spoke of misunderstanding, of external pressures misinterpreting our logistical challenges as defiance. He assured us that the situation was being resolved, that loyalty remained unquestioned. The speech was careful, almost desperate in its restraint. What he did not say was more important than what he did. He did not deny the designation. He could not. Within hours, The first overt measures were enacted. Imperial Navy vessels multiplied in orbit, their arrivals announced by subtle shifts in gravity and light rather than fanfare. Void shields around key installations were reinforced under off-world supervision. Starports were placed under joint control, their towers bristling with unfamiliar auger arrays. Traffic slowed to a crawl, each departure and arrival scrutinized, rerouted, or denied outright. The sky had become a locked door. On the ground, the planetary defense force was mobilized beyond routine readiness. Muster points were activated, reservists called up with little notice, armories that had gathered dust were opened, inventory checked against lists updated by unseen hands. The PDF officers moved with a new rigidity, their orders coming not from local command but from transmitted directives that allowed no interpretation. They did not explain. They enforced. The first clashes were not battles. They were corrections. Enforcer units moved into districts flagged for non-compliance, shutting down unsanctioned gatherings, seizing stockpiles deemed improperly allocated. Resistance was sporadic and poorly organized, born more of frustration than ideology. It was crushed quickly, efficiently, with a level of force calibrated to discourage escalation without yet inviting it. Bodies were removed. Names were logged. The message spread faster than any proclamation could have. In the administratum, our workload became impossible. Data requests arrived continuously, demanding real-time updates on everything from population movement to caloric intake. Entire departments were reassigned overnight, their personnel absorbed into emergency compliance teams. Those who questioned the changes were reminded, gently at first, that refusal now carried a different weight. The word rebellion had transformed every action into evidence. I watched colleagues disappear from their desks, reassigned or detained with equal lack of explanation. Their terminals went dark, access revoked mid-cycle, their names removed from active rosters. No one asked where they had gone. Asking implied concern, and concern implied doubt. Doubt now was indistinguishable from disloyalty. The ecclesiarchy shifted again, this time without subtlety. Sermons named rebellion as a spiritual failing, a disease of pride and fear. Priests spoke of correction through suffering, of worlds that had strayed and been brought back into alignment by righteous force. The emperor's mercy, they reminded us, was vast, but it was not indulgent. The congregations listened in silence, the familiar comfort of ritual now edged with threat. Civilians felt the change most acutely through deprivation. Ration allocations tightened further, priority shifting toward PDF units and essential infrastructure. Power outages became scheduled and extended. Public transit was curtailed, routes rerouted to serve military needs. The official explanation was security. The effect was confinement. People learned quickly how small their world could become when movement was no longer assumed. The first true battle erupted near the outer manufacturing districts, sparked by a PDF attempt to seize control of a distribution hub that had fallen under the influence of local unions resistant to off-world oversight. Shots were fired, casualties mounted. The clash lasted less than an hour before heavier units arrived to end it decisively. By the time it was over, the district was sealed, access restricted pending review. The picked feeds showed smoke and debris, the aftermath framed as regrettable but necessary. The word rebellion had found flesh. Imperial Guard transports began landing soon after, their descent announced by the thunder of retros and the shuddering of hab blocks as mass displaced air. Astra Militarum units disembarked with practiced efficiency, their banners furled, their faces impassive. They did not interact with civilians beyond what was required. Their presence was not reassurance. It was confirmation that the Imperium had moved from correction to enforcement. With them came new authority. Command structures were redefined, local leaders subordinated to off-world officers whose names we struggled to pronounce. Decisions that once took days were now issued as commands to be executed immediately. Appeals were not entertained. The logic was simple and absolute. A rebellious world could not be trusted to govern itself. Rumors spread, darker now, stripped of earlier naivety. Some spoke of inquisitorial oversight, of agents embedded among the guard and administratum, watching for signs of deeper corruption. Others whispered of exterminatus as a theoretical possibility, invoked less as a threat than as an explanation for the sudden urgency. Whether true or not, the effect was the same. Fear became ambient, a constant background hum that shaped behavior more effectively than any edict. I felt the shift within myself as well. Where once I had believed in process, in the idea that errors could be corrected through diligence, I now understood that process served power, not the other way around. The Imperium did not require our understanding. It required our submission. Every keystroke I entered, every report I compiled, carried the knowledge that it might contribute to decisions that would destroy neighborhoods, families, entire districts. Responsibility had expanded beyond intention. The governor attempted one final act of defiance cloaked as diplomacy. He issued a statement reaffirming loyalty, while requesting clarification on the scope of imperial intervention, appealing to precedent and historical compliance. The response arrived within the hour, brief and unambiguous. The matter was under imperial jurisdiction. Local discretion was suspended. The governor's authority was henceforth provisional. He disappeared from public view shortly after. Official channels cited health concerns. Unofficially, it was understood that he had been relieved, whether by arrest or protective custody, no one could say. His successor was announced 2 cycles later, a figure with deep ties to off-world interests and a reputation for uncompromising efficiency. The transition was framed as continuity. It felt like an occupation. Fighting spread unevenly across the planet, flaring where enforcement met organized resistance, dying down where compliance was swift. The PDF fractured under the strain, some units adhering strictly to orders, others hesitating when those orders conflicted with local loyalties. Astra Militarum forces intervened wherever hesitation appeared, their methods swift and instructive. The lesson was clear. Loyalty to the Imperium superseded loyalty to place. In the capital hive, curfews were enforced with increasing severity. Vox grills broadcast updates and restrictions at regular intervals, their tone firm but measured. Public gatherings were prohibited. Unauthorized transmissions were traced and shut down. The flow of information narrowed until official channels were the only ones left standing. Silence returned, but this time it was imposed rather than chosen. I continued my work because stopping was unthinkable. The tithe office had become a nerve center, its data feeding into strategic decisions far beyond our sight. The red sigils multiplied, spreading across files and departments. Our world was being disassembled into variables, assessed for salvageability. The word rebellion was not an accusation. It was a framework. One night, as I left the building under armed escort, I heard distant artillery for the first time. The sound rolled across the city, low and heavy, rattling windows and setting off alarms that no one responded to. It was not aimed at us, not yet. It was a demonstration, a reminder of scale. I stood there longer than necessary, listening, and understood that whatever choices had been made months ago, quietly and incrementally, had culminated in this inevitability. The Imperium had not overreacted. It had reacted exactly as designed. A world that slipped out of alignment had been marked, investigated, and now corrected through force. The tragedy was not that rebellion had been declared. It was that, by the time the word was spoken, there was no longer any path that did not lead through fire. As the guns continued to speak in the distance, and the sky above remained crowded with unfamiliar silhouettes, I realized that rebellion was not an event, but a state imposed from without. It did not require intent, only deviation, and once named, it transformed everything it touched, reducing complexity to obedience and resistance, survival and erasure. The next phase would not ask whether we could return to compliance. It would decide how much of us would remain when the process was complete. Once rebellion had a name, the sky ceased to be neutral. It was no longer a distant canopy of ash-stained clouds and traffic lights tracing predictable paths. It became a ceiling of judgment, layered with augur shadows and contrails that never quite dissipated. Orbital control tightened without announcement, void lanes narrowing as if the planet itself were being drawn into a vice. We felt it in subtle ways first, in the way atmospheric pressure fluctuated when new vessels arrived, in the way the night sky pulsed faintly with reflected engine light. Judgment did not descend suddenly. It assembled itself overhead. Imperial Navy warships settled into geosynchronous positions, their silhouettes invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable on any sanctioned display. Each arrival altered the balance, not through firepower alone, but through implication. These were not escorts or observers. They were arbiters. Their presence redefined every action taken below, rendering local authority provisional and conditional. The planet had not been conquered yet, but it had been claimed. Communications shifted again. Vox traffic was routed through orbital relays controlled by off-world command, delays introduced deliberately, selectively. Messages sent upward were acknowledged with time-stamped receipts rather than responses. The effect was disorienting, like speaking into a void that confirmed your voice existed but refused to answer back. Astropathic choirs were placed under direct supervision, their output monitored for deviation in tone as much as content. The warp itself felt closer, not in a mystical sense, but as a reminder that every word carried risk. The first official decree arrived under the seal of Imperial authority, transmitted simultaneously to all major administrative centers. It outlined the establishment of an orbital blockade, justified under containment protocols. All unauthorized void traffic was prohibited. Resource export was suspended pending review. Incoming aid would be permitted at Imperial discretion. The language was precise, unemotional, its logic unassailable within the framework it invoked. This was not punishment. It was quarantine. On the surface, the effects were immediate. Starports shut down entire wings, their vast concourses falling silent except for the echo of enforcer boots. Merchant crews were detained planetside, their contracts rendered meaningless overnight. Supplies that had once flowed steadily now arrived sporadically, if at all. Prices surged in unofficial markets, and then those markets vanished under enforcement actions that left little room for protest. Scarcity became policy. The Inquisition was never announced, but its influence was unmistakable. Investigations shifted in tone, less concerned with logistics and more with ideology. Records were cross-referenced against sermons, recruitment data against demographic shifts. Individuals were summoned for questioning based on patterns no one else could see. They returned altered. If they returned at all, their answers shorter, their eyes more distant. The question was no longer what had gone wrong. It was how deep the wrongness went. Whispers of exterminatus began to circulate, not as threats, but as explanations. People spoke of it in the same way they spoke of natural disasters, as a possibility too large to personalize. Some insisted it would never be used on a world like ours, that our value and population made us indispensable. Others countered that value was relative, that containment always outweighed preservation when corruption was suspected. No one claimed certainty. Certainty had become dangerous. From orbit, the war took on a different character. Auspex data filtered down in sanitized summaries, showing enemy movements, fleet engagements, and zones of denial. We were told that the Void War remained undecided, that Imperial forces held key positions while contesting others. The language was careful, designed to reassure without promising resolution. The truth, as far as we could tell, was that our fate was being weighed alongside countless others, our survival contingent on calculations made far beyond our influence. The planetary defense force was gradually subordinated to off-world command. Their insignia remained, but authority flowed downward from orbital strategiums rather than local headquarters. PDF units were redeployed to secondary roles, holding ground already deemed expendable, while Astra Militarum forces prepared decisive actions elsewhere. This was not a slight. It was doctrine. Local forces were liabilities when loyalty was in question. Civilians felt the pressure most acutely through absence. Absence of goods, of information, of reassurance. Public announcements became rarer, their content more abstract. The ecclesiarchy filled the gap with constant prayer cycles, their hymns broadcast across vox grills day and night. Faith was no longer presented as comfort. It was framed as insulation, a barrier against the consequences of failure. Pray, and the emperor might spare you. Pray, and the judgment might pass overhead. I found myself studying the sky whenever I could, searching for signs I did not fully understand. A brighter star that held its position too steadily. A faint distortion where light bent around something massive and unseen. Each anomaly sparked a new wave of speculation. Had another battleship arrived? Was something worse assembling beyond sight? The imagination filled the void left by silence, and it was rarely kind. One evening, a sanctioned briefing was distributed to mid-level administratum personnel, outlining contingency outcomes. It spoke in probabilities rather than certainties, listing scenarios based on compliance metrics and threat assessments. Reclamation was one possibility, involving prolonged occupation and restructuring. Partition was another, dividing the planet's assets for more manageable oversight. The final category was listed simply as terminal. Resolution. No details followed. None were needed. The word exterminatus did not appear in the document, but its absence was deliberate. Those who needed to understand did. Those who did not were spared the burden of knowing. The Imperium was not threatening us. It was explaining the logic by which it might erase us, should erasure prove the most efficient solution. Resistance groups attempted to exploit the fear, broadcasting unauthorized messages that framed orbital judgment as proof of imperial tyranny. These transmissions were traced and silenced with ruthless efficiency. The individuals responsible were apprehended publicly, their punishment swift and exemplary. The lesson was reinforced without spectacle. The Imperium did not need martyrs, it needed compliance. As days passed under blockade, the planet's rhythms faltered. Manufacturers shut down entire lines for lack of components. Power was rerouted toward defense and life support, leaving entire districts in rolling darkness. Water purification systems strained under reduced maintenance. Each failure cascaded into the next, a chain reaction born not of enemy action, but of isolation. Judgment from orbit did not require bombardment. It worked by subtraction. I began to understand that the Imperium's greatest weapon was not its guns, but its ability to withdraw permission. Permission to trade, permission to communicate, permission to exist as part of a larger whole. Stripped of those connections, a planet reverted to a closed system, its internal contradictions magnified until they tore it apart from within. Compliance was not enforced solely through violence, it was enforced through dependency. The ecclesiarchy adapted again, this time embracing fatalism. Sermons spoke of trials by fire, of worlds tested and found wanting. Priests urged acceptance of imperial will as divine expression, even if that will manifest it as destruction. To resist was not merely futile, it was sinful. These messages found fertile ground among those exhausted by uncertainty. Submission promised clarity, even if that clarity was annihilation. At night, the sky seemed closer, the stars sharper, as if orbit had tightened its grip. I dreamed of falling upward, pulled not by gravity but by attention, drawn into the gaze of something vast and impersonal. I woke with the sense that decisions were being finalized, that debates far above had narrowed to a few remaining variables. Our behavior now mattered only insofar as it confirmed conclusions already forming. Then came the demonstration. Without warning, an uninhabited moon at the edge of the system was struck. The act was framed as a strategic denial operation, its destruction justified as preventing enemy use. The explosion was visible from the planet's surface, a brief, silent flare that rewrote the night sky. No shockwave reached us, no debris fell. The message was purely symbolic, and therefore absolute. Public reaction was muted. There were no riots, no mass panic. People watched, processed, and returned to their routines with hollow efficiency. The moon had been distant, irrelevant to daily life, and that was precisely why it was chosen. It proved that distance offered no protection. What could be erased out there could be erased here, just as cleanly. After that, the whispers stopped. Fear had reached saturation. What replaced it was resignation, a collective understanding that survival no longer depended on justice or argument, but on alignment. The Imperium had judged us from orbit, not with a verdict, but with options. None of them were kind. All of them were final. As I stood beneath that altered sky, watching the last traces of the moon's light fade into nothing, I understood that judgment did not always come as fire. Sometimes it came as a pause, a held breath in which the condemned were allowed to contemplate the scale of what loomed above them. The next phase would not be decided planetside. It would descend when calculation gave way to execution. And when it did, there would be no appeal left to make. The end did not arrive as a single moment that could be pointed to and named. There was no clear line where judgment became an outcome, no instant where the future snapped shut like a trap. Instead, it unfolded as a narrowing, the range of possible tomorrows shrinking day by day until only one shape remained. By the time we understood what that shape was, it had already begun to settle over us, heavy and inescapable, like ash after a distant fire. The official proclamation came through every sanctioned Vox grill at once, its timing precise to the second. It did not describe what had happened. It described what would be remembered. Our world, the voice said, had been brought back into Imperial compliance through decisive action. Stability was being restored, order reaffirmed. The Emperor's will was enacted. There was no mention of rebellion beyond the abstract, no acknowledgement of error or dispute. History, it seemed, had already been rewritten, even as we stood inside its wreckage. On the surface, the violence slowed. Large-scale engagements ceased, replaced by targeted operations that removed what remained of organized resistance. PDF units were folded fully into off-world command structures or disbanded entirely, their members reassigned, detained, or conscripted into Astra Militarum formations destined for other war zones. Familiar faces vanished from the streets, replaced by uniforms that carried no local insignia. The planet was no longer trusted to defend itself. Civilians emerged cautiously from weeks of confinement, blinking in the harsh light of resumed power cycles. Entire districts lay silent, their hab blocks sealed or emptied, their populations relocated or lost to processes no one explained in detail. Manufacturums restarted under new oversight, production quotas revised upward to compensate for losses elsewhere. Servitors scrubbed streets clean with chemical efficiency, removing scorch marks, bloodstains, and any visible evidence that something had gone wrong here at all. The Imperium did not erase worlds only with fire. It erased them with normalization. Those who survived learned quickly what kind of survival this would be. New identification protocols were instituted. Biometric checks layered atop old systems. Travel permits became harder to obtain. Employment tied more tightly to compliance metrics. The ecclesiarchy remained omnipresent, its sermons now framed as celebrations of deliverance rather than warnings of punishment. The Emperor, they said, had shown mercy by allowing us to endure. Gratitude was expected to follow. I returned to the administratum building weeks later, stepping into halls that looked unchanged but felt fundamentally different. Entire departments had been dissolved, their functions absorbed into streamlined offices, staffed by unfamiliar personnel. Data access was more restricted, workflows simplified to minimize deviation. Where once there had been layers of interpretation, now there were only instructions. Efficiency had replaced deliberation. The system no longer tolerated ambiguity. Records of the rebellion were classified under sealed archives, accessible only to those with authority that did not originate in this world. Public histories described the period as one of temporary logistical disruption exacerbated by external threats. Names were omitted, timelines compressed, causes abstracted. The story was clean, coherent, and false in a way that left no room for challenge. Memory, I realized, was not something the Imperium allowed to develop organically. It was curated. The governor's name disappeared from public mention entirely. His successor, now firmly entrenched, presided over ceremonies reaffirming loyalty and unity. Monuments were erected in prominent plazas, their inscriptions praising the restoration of order and the sacrifices made to achieve it. The wording was careful, honoring service without specifying who had served or against what. People attended these unveilings because attendance was noted. They applauded because applause was expected. In private spaces, where vox grills did not reach and walls felt less attentive, people spoke carefully of what they remembered. These conversations were brief, fragmented, often interrupted by a shared understanding that speaking too much risked everything that had been regained. Memory survived in glances, in pauses, in the way certain streets were avoided without explanation. The Imperium might control history, but it could not entirely prevent recollection. It could only make it dangerous. I found that my own memories began to change under the pressure. Not in content, but in weight. Events that had once felt overwhelming receded into something distant, like a storm viewed from orbit rather than ground level. Other moments, insignificant at the time, grew sharper. A missed confirmation, a red sigil pulsing on a terminal, a silence that lasted too long. These fragments carried more truth than any official record, and I guarded them carefully, aware that they existed only as long as I did. The wider Imperium moved on quickly. Other crises demanded attention. Other worlds slipped out of alignment, were corrected, absorbed, or erased. Our planet became a data point, a resolved case, cited in internal doctrine as an example of effective intervention. Its value lay not in what it had been, but in what it taught. Deviations were costly. Silence was not safe. Compliance was not optional. Occasionally, off-world personnel rotated through, administratum officials or guard units passing through on their way to other assignments. They spoke of our world with detached familiarity, referencing its recent instability as something already concluded. To them, it was history. To us, it was still present, embedded in infrastructure and habit. The difference was disorienting, a reminder that scale dictated perspective, and that small worlds were allowed only limited time to grieve. The ecclesiarchy declared a day of thanksgiving to mark the planet's full reintegration. Attendance was mandatory. The sermons were triumphant, framing endurance as proof of righteousness. The Emperor's protection, they said, had been manifest in the sparing of our world. No mention was made of those who had not been spared. The omission was complete, seamless, and devastating in its efficiency. As the years passed, children grew up learning a version of events that bore little resemblance to what had occurred. They were taught that the Imperium had intervened swiftly to correct administrative failings, that any hardship endured was a necessary purification. They learned hymns that praised unity and obedience, and they sang them without irony. For them, the rebellion existed only as a cautionary abstraction, stripped of faces and consequences. I sometimes wondered what would happen when these children grew old enough to ask questions, when the cracks between lived experience and taught history became harder to ignore. The Imperium had prepared for that too. Education emphasized loyalty over curiosity, service over analysis. Questions were framed as dangerous indulgences. Most would never be asked aloud. Those that were would be answered swiftly and decisively. In the end, what remained was not defiance or regret, but adaptation. People adjusted to the new parameters of existence, finding ways to live within constraints that had become permanent. The planet continued to function, its output flowing outward once more, its population contributing to wars and projects they would never see. From a distance, it appeared stable. From orbit, it was compliant. I stood one evening at a viewport overlooking the capital hive, watching traffic resume its steady patterns beneath a sky no longer crowded with warships. The stars looked the same as they always had, indifferent and distant. Somewhere out there, the Imperium's records listed our world as resolved, its deviation corrected, its lesson learned. That was what the Imperium remembered. What it did not remember were the individuals who had lived through the narrowing, who had felt silence turn into suspicion, suspicion into judgment. It did not remember hesitation, or doubt, or the small moments where different choices might have altered the course by degrees too fine to measure. It did not need to. The Imperium survived by remembering only what was useful. I understood then that this was the true consequence of trying to leave. Not annihilation, though that was always possible. Not occupation, though that was likely. The true consequence was absorption, the way a body absorbs a wound, leaving scar tissue behind, but continuing onward as if nothing had happened. The pain remained localized, unacknowledged by the whole. As I turned away from the viewport and returned to my work, I carried that understanding with me. The Imperium did not ask worlds to love it. It asked them to endure, to function, to submit their stories to a larger narrative that had no room for deviation. Those who tried to step outside that narrative were not remembered as rebels or visionaries. They were remembered, if at all, as errors corrected. And somewhere in that vast grinding system, that was enough.